Ever stop to think that that feeling you get when you're totally alone? Maybe it's more than just, quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Turns out there are actual names for a really intense version of that. Autophobia, monophobia.
Isolophobia, eremophobia.
Oh, yeah, quite a few.
Right. And what we're diving into today, it's not just feeling a bit lonely sometimes.
Hmm.
The material we've looked at describes something, well, much more significant, a real intense anxiety.
That's right. And what's interesting is you might not see autophobia as its own big heading in, say, the main diagnostic manuals everywhere,
Okay.
but the information is clear. It is a recognized thing. It fits under specific phobia in the ICD-11 classification system, and the DSM-5 calls it a situational type specific phobia.
So it's definitely acknowledged by professionals, even if the name isn't front and center.
Exactly. It's a real experience with real impact.
Because when you first hear autophobia, I mean, my first thought might be, oh, fear of oneself.
Right. A common misconception.
And our sources really stress, nope, that's not it. Not at all. It's not about being scared of your own thoughts in that literal sense. And definitely not about cars.
Right. Good to clarify. So this deep dive is really about getting under the skin of what this fear of being alone is truly about.
Precisely. We've got some really detailed material here. It covers the definition, the symptoms people experience, where it might come from, potential causes, and importantly, treatments.
So the goal today is to kind of unpack all of that for you listening, give you a clear picture of autophobia, what it is, what it feels like, and what the sources say can be done without getting totally bogged down in jargon.
Exactly. Making it understandable.
Okay, so let's start there. The definition. What is autophobia, basically?
Well, fundamentally, it's a specific phobia. That means it's an intense, persistent fear or dread. And it's specifically about being alone, isolated, abandoned, even feeling ignored.
And you mentioned morbid fear in some definitions. That sounds quite strong.
It is. It highlights that this isn't just, preferring company. It actually triggers significant anxiety. Severe anxiety, really.
Severe anxiety, that's a key point. And it's not just about being physically alone in a room, right? That's one of the surprising things I read.
Exactly. That's crucial.
Yeah,
The fear can pop up in different ways.
right.
Someone might be physically alone and feel completely overwhelmed, terrified they can't handle something on their own.
Okay.
But, and this is really important, they could also be in a packed room
Wow.
and still feel totally isolated, totally secluded, gripped by this fear of being abandoned emotionally, even with people right there.
That sounds incredibly lonely in itself. Feeling alone when you're surrounded by people.
It really does.
And our material connects this to other things too, like trauma, general anxiety, depression.
Yes, there are definitely connections. If you look at the broader picture of anxiety conditions, autophobia is often seen as part of the agoraphobic cluster.
Agoraphobic cluster, what does that mean, sort of?
It means it shares some features with other anxiety issues, like certain hyperventilation disorders. A common theme in this cluster is often a worry about getting help if there's emergency.
Okay, that makes total sense. If you're afraid of being alone, the thought of needing help and having no one there, that would be terrifying.
Precisely. It hits that core fear.
Our sources also seem careful to separate autophobia from things like, say, agoraphobia itself or social anxiety, but they can be related.
They can be very closely related, yes,
Mm-hmm.
and someone might experience them at the same time, what we call comorbidity.
Right.
But the focus is different. Social anxiety is more about the fear of judgment in social situations.
Hmm.
Agoraphobia, often about fear of public spaces where escape feels hard. Autophobia zeroes in on the being alone part.
Got it.
Though, as the sources mentioned, there's also a reported link sometimes with borderline personality disorder, where intense fears of abandonment are often a central feature.
Okay, so we're building a picture here. Definition, nuances, connections. Let's talk about the experience itself. What does it actually feel like? What are the signs, the symptoms?
Well, the material shows symptoms can vary, naturally, but there are common threads.
Mm.
Mentally, people might have this awful fear they're going to faint, or they find it impossible to concentrate on anything but the fear itself. Maybe even a fear of, like, losing their mind or just not being able to think straight.
That sounds incredibly distressing, just those mental symptoms alone. What about emotionally?
Emotionally, there's often a lot of stress and worry building up before they're even alone, anticipating it. A constant fear of being secluded, isolated.
And physically. Anxiety often shows up physically, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Classic physical anxiety responses. Things like feeling lightheaded, dizzy, sweaty, shaky,
Mm-hmm.
nausea, sometimes those weird hot and cold flashes, numbness or tingling, dry mouth,
Mm.
a racing heart, is very common.
Yeah.
Some people might even feel kind of frozen, unable to move when they're alone, or have really noticeable shaking in their hands and legs.
It really sounds like it can trigger a full-on panic attack.
It definitely can. The sources specifically mention panic attacks happening when someone is alone, which is, similar in mechanism to how social anxiety might trigger panic in social situations.
And that must create a terrible cycle, right? Fear of being alone leads to panic when alone, which makes the fear even worse.
Exactly. It becomes self-reinforcing.
Mm.
And the sources also link it to depression, sometimes the fear associated with autophobia, maybe fear of public places because they might end up alone, can make simple tasks feel impossible.
And there's an element of self-doubt, too. The material mentioned a parallel with agoraphobia, like not trusting yourself to handle things alone.
Yes, that comes through. A kind of lowered self-confidence when it comes to managing activities independently. It's all tied into that core fear.
Right.
And a really common and scary symptom mentioned is catastrophizing, imagining the absolute worst thing happening when they're alone.
Like what?
Like genuinely believing they could have a panic attack and die from it with no one there to help.
Gosh, that's intense. So, okay, let's shift to the why. Where does this often come from? What are the potential roots?
Looking at the background, the sources frequently point towards early childhood experiences, particularly abandonment.
Abandonment. How so?
Well, it could be emotional abandonment, feeling neglected, or financial issues leading to isolation, or actual physical isolation. Any of these can cause trauma and plant a deep fear of being abandoned again later.
That makes a lot of sense. Feeling unsupported or left vulnerable young could definitely leave a scar. Are there other factors too?
Yes, major life changes later on can also play a role, perhaps worsening an existing tendency or even triggering it.
Like what kind of changes?
Things like maybe losing a loved one or the end of a really significant relationship.
Ah, okay.
And the people who just generally have higher levels of anxiety might be more susceptible to developing it.
So it often starts young, but it can emerge later. Triggered by loss, maybe?
That seems to be the case. The initial fear might even be very specific, like, I'm afraid of being without this particular person.
Right.
But then the material explains that can sometimes widen out, generalize, into a broader fear of being alone in any context.
And we should probably quickly touch on those other names again. Monophobia, isolophobia. Are they exactly the same as autophobia?
Very closely related, but there can be subtle differences in emphasis depending on the source. For instance, one dictionary might define eremophobia strictly as fear of being isolated.
Okay.
Another source defined autophobia as fear of solitude or oneself, although, as we said, the oneself part is generally seen as a misunderstanding of the core fear, which is about being alone.
Got it. So nuances exist, but the central theme is that fear of solitude or isolation.
Exactly.
So if someone listening thinks, this sounds familiar, what's the process for actually getting diagnosed?
Well, the sources say it involves a proper psychological assessment, usually by a mental health professional, like a psychologist or psychiatrist.
And they'd look at medical history too.
Definitely. To rule out any physical causes for the symptoms, thyroid issues or heart problems, that sort of thing.
Makes sense. And what's the key thing they're looking for to say, yes, this looks like autophobia?
The big one, the key diagnostic criterion, is whether the fear significantly messes with your daily life.
Messes with it how?
Like, it stops you doing things, interferes with work, relationships, basic routines, because the anxiety is so overwhelming. It's not just discomfort, it's disruption.
Okay, disruption is the key word.
Right. And the sources also mentioned that cycle we talked about, becoming overly dependent on others, avoiding being alone,
Right.
which just digs the anxiety in deeper.
Right, that avoidance loop. Okay, so if it is diagnosed, what then? Are there treatments? Is there hope?
Absolutely, there's hope. While the sources are clear there's no single magic cure because it affects everyone differently, there are definitely effective treatments. Psychotherapy is usually the main approach.
Like talk therapy.
Exactly. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is mentioned a lot. That helps people identify and challenge those negative thought patterns driving the fear.
And exposure therapy, that sounds intense.
It's done very carefully and gradually. The idea is to slowly, safely increase the time spent alone, building tolerance, and reducing the fear response over time with the therapist's guidance.
Okay, gradually makes sense. What about medication?
Meds can play a role, yeah. Mostly for managing the anxiety symptoms to make therapy more effective, or for severe cases. The sources mention things like beta blockers, certain antidepressants like SSRIs, and sometimes sedatives like benzodiazepines, usually for short-term use.
So a combination approach often. Therapy, maybe meds.
Often, yes. And other things can help too. Complementary therapies like mindfulness or meditation.
How do they help?
They can help people stay more present, less swept away by the intensity of the fear when it hits, sort of grounding techniques.
Right.
And building self-confidence is also mentioned as helpful. Things like pursuing hobbies, fitness, achieving personal goals. It can reduce that feeling of needing someone else there all the time.
Fostering independence in other areas might bleed over into feeling more capable alone. That makes intuitive sense.
It does.
The material also mentioned a potential problem, people not realizing it's a treatable thing, or trying to self-medicate.
Yeah, that's a real concern. Sometimes people just don't know what they're experiencing has a name or that help is available. And sadly, some might turn to alcohol or drugs to cope.
Which usually backfires, right?
Almost always makes the underlying anxiety worse in the long run. But the good news, the really encouraging part, is that people who do seek professional help often report significant relief.
That's really important to hear. And for milder cases, any simpler tips mentioned?
Yeah, for less severe feelings, sometimes simple things can help create a sense of presence, like having music playing when you're doing chores or out and about.
Or the TV on in the background at home?
Exactly. Using sound can kind of fill the space and make the silence feel less empty or threatening for some people.
But again, it's crucial to remember that just feeling a bit uneasy alone sometimes is totally normal.
Totally normal.
Hmm.
It only potentially becomes autophobia when that fear really starts running your life and stopping you from doing things.
The disruption factor again.
Precisely.
Now, there was a really interesting, maybe deeper connection mentioned, linking autophobia to death anxiety from back in 1969.
Yes, that was striking. It suggests a close relationship between the fear of being alone and that more fundamental fear of death, or maybe a feeling of impending doom.
How does that play out?
Well, someone with autophobia might experience really intense physical symptoms, like hyperventilation, specifically when they're alone. And it can feel so extreme they actually think they're suffocating or dying.
Wow.
And that feeling can be directly tied to an underlying anxiety about death.
Gosh, that sounds absolutely terrifying. And it works both ways, potentially.
Seems so. The sources suggest someone already anxious about death might be more prone to developing autophobia.
Why is that?
Maybe had a fear of being alone if something bad did happen, getting seriously ill or injured with no one around.
Ah, the no one to help fear again, but linked to mortality.
Exactly. And as we touched on before, this ties back into the agoraphobic cluster idea that fear of isolation during a time of need, potentially a life or death need.
It really highlights how deep these fears can run. The sources also briefly mentioned seeing autophobia pop up in culture.
Yeah, just a few examples. There's apparently a webcomic called Autophobia,
Okay.
and a song by the electronic artist deadmau5 called Monophobia, and even a Telugu film mentioned Atitha Pava, based on the concept.
Interesting how these things get reflected artistically. It shows they resonate. And finally, just to round things out, the material listed some related conditions.
Yes, just as a pointer, really, showing how autophobia can sometimes overlap or coexist with other things. The list included agoraphobia, which we've discussed, borderline personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, and even narcissism was mentioned as having potential links in some contexts.
It just underlines how complex mental health is, doesn't it? How things can be interconnected.
Definitely. It's rarely just one thing in isolation.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive. It feels clear that autophobia is way more than just, not liking your own company.
Much more, yeah.
It's a significant fear, could be physical isolation, could be emotional, triggering, intense anxiety. We've seen it has all sorts of symptoms, mental, emotional, physical, potential roots in past experiences, links to other anxieties, even that deep connection to death anxiety.
But also importantly that it's understood, it's diagnosable, and there are effective ways to treat it.
Absolutely. And maybe the key takeaway for you listening is just recognizing this is a real thing for people. It's not trivial. And having some empathy and understanding goes a long way.
Couldn't agree more.
So here's maybe a final thought to leave you with.
Yep.
In this world where we're hyper connected all the time, digitally at least, why do you think the fear of being truly alone might still be so powerful for some people? What does that maybe tell us about our basic human need for connection? Or maybe our anxieties about just relying on ourselves?
That's a great question to ponder.
Or maybe, on a more personal level, if you ever feel uneasy when you are alone, what small things, what little comfort strategies could give you a sense of presence or connection, even without another person physically being there?
Yeah, finding those personal anchors. And if any of this resonated or just sparked your interest, definitely explore it further. Look into resources on anxiety, on phobias. There's always more to learn about ourselves and each other.